there appears to be evidence that heavy amounts of aerobic, especially subthreshold efforts, activity may result in right-sided cardiac dilatation, it looks like, stretching, and which may be the driver of paradoxical rise we're seeing in dysrhythmia. So perhaps you could just explain that for the lay audience that's listening to this, but the idea that what we think is exactly what we should be doing, or that some people might think could be doing us, in fact, harm. And the question I put in the margins there was subthreshold, what percentage max heart rate are we talking about? Because later in the piece, there's a discussion of walking, which gets the green light. But I'd love to hear you expand on this a little bit.
Yeah. So it's been generally sort of not acknowledged that readily, but if you actually go back and look through the literature, which I did about 3 months ago, I wanted to look at the literature of atrial fibrillation, which I'll explain in a second, and athletes. So why did I want to do this? Because I basically started noticing every person I knew was getting AFib. So people who were older than me, my peers, people, patients that were coming to me who were, stud athletes. I mean, obviously they weren't all getting atrial fibrillation, but enough of them were that I was sort of like, what in the heck is going on here? So atrial fibrillation is a rhythm of the heart where the atrium, that's the smaller collection chambers on the top of the heart, to be contrasted with the ventricles that have to do the big pumping. The atria, which only transmit blood into the ventricles, if you get beats that are generated there that are not what we would call a normal sinus beat. So there's a part of the heart that generates, like there's a pacemaker within the heart that generates the normal regular beat that you can feel if you put your hand on your wrist or your chest. And atrial fibrillation is an irregular beat. And it often gets kicked off with what we call a rapid ventricular response. So it can sometimes start beating so quickly that even the ventricle picks up that beat, and all of a sudden you've got this horrible heart rate. Atrial fibrillation is a very dangerous beat in the wrong patient. So it's very dangerous in people who are older or who get it for the reasons of, ischemia, meaning lack of blood flow to the heart, because not only does it lead to demise directly, but it can predispose you to forming clots within the chambers of the heart that then get lodged up in the brain. So older patients who are on atrial fibrillation, even younger patients who are on it where they stay in atrial fibrillation long enough, are usually put on very aggressive blood thinning medication. So the question is, why are all these athletes getting it, right? Because it seems disproportionate, right? So if you look at the population as a whole and say, how many 40-year-olds have AFib? The answer is like none. Right. But if you look at cyclists, it's like 10%, right? If you look at runners, it's a little bit lower. And so there's actually, so anyway, this is what so I basically started looking through all this literature, and a couple things come up. So there's a guy by the name of James O'Keefe, who's a cardiologist at the university. I think he's at Wisconsin. And he's, a great athlete himself and a cardiologist, but he's also been interested in this for a long period of time. He's got some ideas which suggest that long amounts of sort of pretty exhausting cardiac stuff, the stuff you'd experience if you were, riding in an Ironman or doing something really hard or running a marathon really hard, it actually creates a stretch in the heart. Now, we know that's true. That's how we increase cardiac output. But it does so at a level that the right side of the heart can't compensate as well as the left. So the left side of the heart is very muscular because it's needed to pump blood against the entire resistance of the body. The right side of the heart is actually not muscular because it only needs to pump against the lungs, which are a very low resistance system.
Which side has the higher musculature?
Left. So the left ventricle, if you took a normal heart out of the body and did an autopsy on somebody or sampled, took a heart out of a sheep's body or something, you'd see this very thick muscular left wall, and then the right one collapses. You barely see it. And again, it's because in normal physiology, one of them is pumping against like 120 millimeters of mercury. The other one's pumping against like 20 millimeters of mercury.
Right.
When you exercise, when you really, really throw down the hammer, you have to increase cardiac output. Meaning, how do we measure that? We measure that in liters per minute. How many liters per minute of blood are going through your body? And so if I'm sitting here right now talking with you, Tim, my cardiac output is 3, 4, maybe 5 liters per minute. When I'm in a race, when I'm doing an all out threshold, sub-threshold effort, I'm at 25 to 30 liters per minute. And I get that not just by beating faster, which gets me part of it, but by taking bigger beats each time.
Stroke
and
volume.
That's the stretch. You got it. That's the stroke volume. And so what O'Keefe has argued and certainly showed in animal models, and there's a ton of epidemiology that certainly suggests it, although, we just don't have I don't think we're ever going to have a clinical trial that can demonstrate this one way or the other, is there's a subset of people, for reasons I don't know, who are susceptible, where chronic right-sided dilatation over and over again leads to distortion of the right side, which leads to atrial fibrillation, or worse, fatal dysrhythmias. We do see it. Fortunately, it's quite rare, but nevertheless, it's tragic, where we see these athletes dying suddenly. And this is not what we typically think of as the sudden athlete death, which is is actually massive left-sided hypertrophy. That's a separate cause. But I think we're seeing more commonly young athletes dropping dead from what looks like a heart attack, only to find out their coronary arteries are pristine.
Huh. Now, if someone is not a professional athlete, like you said, they're not going to lose $1 million sponsorship deal by changing their form of exercise. Tentatively, what would be your recommendations for perhaps things to minimize or ration a bit, or things to do more of?
Well, look, this is where I'm certainly the most hypocritical in all of the things I think about, right? I mean,
you're doing precisely.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and I wrote about this. I'm very transparent about this, right? Which is, right now I look at my approach to cycling as completely illogical. Like, there's no upside in it, and there's just downside. And that says nothing about the risk of getting hit by a car and all the other stupid things that unfortunately happen. But for whatever reason, it's scratching an itch within me that is giving me so much pleasure that I'm just, every year I just sort of say, well, one more year. And I don't know, maybe I'm waiting for that first bout of AFib, and then I'm going to be like, I'm done. And hopefully the AFib goes away. So I think what I'd want to reiterate is, look, you got to balance your own happiness and sanity with sort of your desire to live as long as is humanly possible. And I think that if I couldn't ride my bike, I would just be very unhappy, no matter how much, even if it gave me an extra 5 years of life. Yeah. At some point, that might not be true. That said, so for people that I take care of who are like me, I don't try to talk someone out of doing this, right? What I do, though, Tim, is nothing breaks my heart more than seeing that person who's struggling to lose weight, who thinks that they need to be running, 20 miles a week. And it's like, they have no desire to do it, right? Their knees hurt, they hate it, and they're not losing weight. And I'm like, well, I've got great news for you. You don't ever need to run another step a day in your life, because there's no value in that, right? There is value in exercise, though. And I do think that the most important type of exercise, especially in terms of bang for your buck, is going to be really high intensity, heavy strength training.
And that's for mitochondrial density?
I think it's mitochondrial density. I think it's also just general glucose disposal.
Right.
I also think it matters as far as aging us, right? Meaning, so many of the injuries we get as we age are kind of not just orthopedic, like as in, I have, neck pain or knee pain, but a result of our inability to be strong. Right. It's sort of like,
is that sarcopenia? Is that the fancy way to say it?
Yeah. I mean, that's a more extreme sense, but yeah, it's sort of like, you're going out to, play ball with your kid, and, you get hurt doing it. Right. And it's not that you're hurt because of anything you did that you didn't have the athletic ability to do. It's that you've been a bit deconditioned at the muscular level. I mean, I'll give you an extreme example, right? If you look at the best athletes in, I don't know, pick your favorite league, the NBA, the NFL. You look at them at their peak, and then you look at them when they leave. What's the difference? What's the difference between LeBron James today and LeBron James 10 years from now? Because I don't think anybody disputes in 10 years, he will either be retired or a fraction of what he is today. What's the difference? Is it athletic skill? Will he have less ball handling ability? Not a chance. The difference will be strength. He will be weaker on a strength to body weight ratio, he will be weaker in 10 years than he is today. And so I'm not saying that his strength is what makes him a great athlete today. His great athleticism is due to a number of factors, but I'm saying that the thing that deteriorates as we age is our basically our power to weight ratio. Yep. And so I like to see people, whether they are
not
athletes,
absolute strength. You're talking about relative strength.
Yeah, I think it's power to weight. I don't think that we necessarily are going to increase our strength. Like, I'll never be as strong as I was when I was a power lifter in high school. I mean, I used to, I mean, at a weight of 160, I could deadlift 500 pounds and squat 425. I mean, yeah. I have no desire to do that again, right? But the point is, I think I can increase my power to weight ratio now, and I can keep it there. And I can do it using muscles that are also a huge part of glucose disposal and metabolic health.
Mm-hmm. Now, so just a quick question, a couple of quick questions. The first is, do you think, if you look at, let's say, the careers of boxers like Muhammad Ali, and there are other boxers like George Foreman. Now, George Foreman remained strong for a very long period of time, and he was able to come back out of retirement and compete because his style didn't necessitate speed, whereas you have, say, an Ali where, for any number of reasons, speed seems to be the first thing to go. Is that a reflection of a loss of strength in some sense, or is that a loss of neurotransmitters that just give you better sort of conductivity from the brain to your periphery or other?
Yeah, so it's a couple things. So Ali's case is complicated because I think there's a huge appreciation in the neurology community now that, dementia pugilistica, which is the brain damage that we see in boxers, which is not what happened to Muhammad Ali. Of course, he got Parkinson's disease. But of course, it's hard to make the case that boxing didn't accelerate that. Maybe he would have always got Parkinson's. But
Tyson's another good example because his style was so predicated on speed.
Yeah. So speed is power, right? Yeah. So speed requires strength. There's no such thing as speed without strength. And it's funny because boxing is a sport I love so much, or I used to. I couldn't care for the sport now. But at the time, most people don't appreciate how hard Ali hit. Yeah. Right. I mean, you just go back and watch Ali versus Cleveland Williams and tell me Ali couldn't knock, a fire pole over. So yeah, styles make it, absolutely, right? And it seems that actually Foreman's a bit of an exception. Usually brawlers tend to burn out first in boxing because brawlers are typically more one-trick ponies. I almost attribute George Foreman. Remember, he had two careers, right? Like he sort of, after Ali beat him, he then lost, I think, to Jimmy Ellis in 1977 and then retired and then literally just, went off the face of the earth and then shows up 10 years later, kind of reinvented. It's sort of an amazing story.
Made $120 million with the George Foreman grill and came back a new man.
Yeah.
It was an amazing story. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think you're right. I think that strength is basically everything that I describe as follows. It's firing of the transmitter in the brain, right? It's the neuron fire. It's the impulse down to the motor end unit, and it's the contraction. That's what I mean by strength. And I think that's the element that deteriorates. Now, the million-dollar question is, why is it deteriorating, and what can we do to delay the deterioration? Mm-hmm. I don't know the answer, but I believe the answer is it deteriorates due to lack of use. We basically stop training it in a way that we once did. Now, I think that there's something inherent that's causing the deterioration, meaning I just think there's some aspect of aging that is slowing that down. But I think we can delay it with a specific and certain type of training that replicates the switch, if you will.
No, definitely. And it brings to mind a rather embarrassing experience that I had with you where we went to the gym together and, we did a bunch of glute medius exercises. And for those who don't know what that means, just imagine the side of your hip, basically. I know this is vastly simplified, but imagine you're then laying on one side like a Suzanne Summers or Jane Fonda doing, we weren't doing exactly clamshells, but we were doing a lot of glute medius exercise. And it was agonizing. I just remember kind of rolling around on the floor. It was quite a show for everyone, but it really made me realize that as a non-competitive athlete at this point, sitting down oftentimes in chairs that are not very ergonomically set with kind of my knees splayed out or crossing my feet under a chair, whatever it might be, my glute medius had become so weak. As soon as I did literally 3 or 4 of that workout, I felt like my hip stability, my knee stability, my ankle stability, the entire sort of chain from the floor up was improved. And I felt, one could argue, younger, but it was simply from conditioning, muscles that had become deconditioned from too much, desk monkey work.
Yeah, I mean those are motor end units that hadn't been firing, and glute med's one of my favorites, which is why it's just a huge part of what I do. But the same is true of most muscles that control lateral movement. I am all for deadlifts. I think it's probably the single best exercise you could do. If you could only limit yourself to one exercise in life, it'd be a hex bar deadlift. But you got to be a little bit careful because most sort of exercises like that are typically working muscles in a forward plane. And most athletes are actually weakest in the lateral plane. And so we've always got to keep in mind that very strong glute med, very strong tensor fascia lata, very strong vastus medialis, completely essential for knee, hip alignment and longevity of performance. Again, that can be like literally gardening and walking and doing the stuff that I think we most realize we want to be doing when we're in our 90s.